groundbreaking Guidelines for Moral Instruction in California Public Schools, which located the true villain behind Muck Muck and Little Pedro: secular humanism. In addition to accusing secular humanists of promoting boring literature, the guidelines also blamed them for teaching such evils as sex education, Marxism, and evolution. Outraged American conservatives soon answered the secular humanist infiltration of the American education system in the courts. In 1972, the religion editor of the Washington Evening Star sued the National Science Foundation in the interest of 40 million evangelical Christians for funding a biology textbook that failed to mention the important science of creationism. The suit accused the government of establishing as the official religion of the United States secular humanism. He lost. I'm going to skip a bit here. There are a few more cases that conservatives mounted against the religion of secular humanism, all of which lost. Which brings us up to 1978. So when the IRS moved against Seg academies in the August of 1978, the Christian soldiers were already manning the trenches and deploying advanced teams. They knew exactly who was behind the proposal and what its hidden purpose was. A former Nixon staffer, an up-and-coming news commentator named Pat Buchanan, spelled out the coercive role of the IRS in secular humanism's stealthy, slippery slope assault. The so-called segregation academies established everywhere that some judge has handed down an integration order or busing decision have long been public enemy number one at the IRS, he said. But this new procedure is a new departure, and its implications are sweeping. If allowed to stand, every private school in the country can be threatened with loss of its tax exemption if it does not conform with the social values of the secular humanism, which is the newly established religion of the United States. The response to public entreaties from Wolraich, Buchanan, and other conservative leaders was overwhelming. The IRS received 120,000 letters of protest, more than it ever collected in response to a proposed change. Southern defenders of white privilege like Senator Strom Thurmond joined religious right newcomers like Representative Stephen Sims and Senator Orrin Hatch in excoriating the IRS. Senator Jesse Helms, who exemplified both Southern racism and Christian evangelicalism, was a fitting leader for the legislative counterattack against the collectivist, totalitarian, counterfeit religion, as he called it, of secular humanism. He sponsored a bill to prohibit the IRS from enforcing anti-discrimination rules. This time the bill passed and the IRS capitulated, leaving singed globs of secular humanist goo splattered across the steps of Capitol Hill. Paul Wolraich and Jerry Falwell launched the moral majority. The religious right had found its roar. So I'll skip the rest of the chapter on secular humanism, but touch at the end its legacy. But though the dream has faded, the war against secular humanism left a rich legacy that conservative strategists have tapped again and again. Bill O'Reilly's progressive secularists, for example, are direct descendants of the mythical secular humanists of yore. Though the progressive secularists focused on Christmas spirit rather than textbook indoctrination, they shared the secular humanist objective of a brave new progressive world and their penchant for Christian persecution. Indeed, many influential secular humanists, including the ACLU, the activist judges, and the liberal media, evidently converted to progressive secularism en masse sometime in the 1990s, joining forces with new secular schemers like George Soros, Peter Lewis, and MediaMatters.org. In 2010, Glenn Beck stripped O'Reilly's progressive secularists of their secularism, leaving them bare progressives. He told leaders, "What we're talking about is an ideological movement that has set its sight on the destruction of the Constitution and the fundamental transformation of our republic. It's called the progressive movement." Beck's progressives, led by Obama, Pelosi, and the documentary director Michael Moore, are even more vicious and ideological amorphous than their predecessors. Combining the revolutionary ambitions of 1950s communists with the repressive tendencies of the 1970s secular humanists, the progressives don't actually stand for anything except the destruction of all that is good in America. Every cause they champion is part of their master plan to seize power and tyrannize everyone. But that's a story for another chapter. More broadly, conservatives found in the chimera of secular humanism and the IRS desegregation threat a new strategy for extending and mobilizing their political base. Invent a liberal conspiracy that indoctrinates children with immoral anti-Christian ideas. They have repeatedly exploited the fear of malicious brainwashing to provoke outraged hostility towards anything they oppose, including women's rights, gay rights, sex education, pornography, and the teaching of evolution, as well as to incite resentment against a certain president who may be a Marxist. In the process, they began to hew a new fissure in American society, transforming modest political divisions into a ferocious, unbridled conflict between white Christian conservatives and their imaginary persecutors on the left. The fissure has grown steadily through the decades, exacerbating factionalism and undermining mutual trust until it reached a point where the President of the United States cannot speak to America's students about the value of education without provoking a nationwide paroxysm of paranoid hysteria. So I have one more reading, and this will be brief with more talking. And I'm going to address the elections that we've had, and maybe you heard about them. When the Tea Parties exploded in 2009, the pundits were initially dumbfounded about what to make of them, and the conventional wisdom soon became that they were a product of the economic recession. And then so when Tea Party candidates challenged moderate Republicans and replaced them with people like Christine O'Donnell of Delaware and Sharon Angle of Nevada and Rand Paul of Kentucky, the pundits looked at it as a populist uprising against the mainstream incumbents. But in fact, the Tea Parties, while the actual organizations are new, they don't represent a new movement, in my opinion. They're simply the latest instance of the persecution politics movement, which is 35 years old and started in the late 1970s. For example, when they were challenging moderates in the elections, challenging the moderates in Delaware and Nevada, that was a strategy that was used by Paul Wolraich back in the 1970s. He and his colleagues of the New Right raised a lot of money to take on the liberal and moderate Republicans of the day, and actually, through their purges, forced a lot of them from office. I mean, there were a number of Republicans in the Northeast back in the 70s, and they were quite liberal or moderate, and they've all essentially been eliminated as a result of these purges, which are very much like the Tea Party purges that we've seen in the past, this past year. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about how those purges worked and what it's doing to the country. As I burrowed into the history of the modern conservative movement while writing this book, the Republican Party often took me by surprise. Not because of the extremism of some Republican leaders, but because of the wide diversity of opinions and ideologies that the party once tolerated. The GOP has grown increasingly conservative over the past few decades, but to read prominent Republicans expressing opinions that would now be considered heresy was nonetheless startling. As when chairman of the Wisconsin Republican Party told Paul Wolraich, "Our business people would think it was strange that we're getting involved in a religious issue." Or the party's timid non-committal abortion plank from 1976. The question of abortion is one of the most difficult and controversial of our time. It is undoubtedly a moral and personal issue, but also involves complex questions relating to medical science and criminal justice. There are those in our party who favor complete support for the Supreme Court decision, which permits abortion on demand. There are others who share sincere convictions that the Supreme Court's decision must be changed by a constitutional amendment prohibiting all abortions. Others have yet to take a position, or they have assumed a stance somewhere in between polar positions. But starting in the late 1970s, such heterodox ideas began falling out of the party platform. There was no single moment of metamorphosis, but rather a series of small mutations, as younger right-wing ideologues gradually replaced the liberal and moderate Republicans of a previous era. These mutations are still taking place. With the liberal and Republicans long gone and the moderates nearly extinct, dogmatic Tea Party supporters are now expunging conservative legislators who are not conservative enough. They are continuing to push the party even further into the sooty, smoky fire of paranoid extremism. It's worth noting that, in the previous section, I mentioned that Orrin Hatch was one of the original New Right insurgents, conservative insurgents. He was one of the people that Paul Weyrich got in. And as soon as the election were over, Eric Erickson of a political blog, redstate.com, who's been one of the Tea Party voices, made up a list of people he wanted to purge in 2012. And one of those on the list was Orrin Hatch. So it shows you how far we've come. Over the years, political analysis have offered various explanations for the rightward drift of the GOP. Some point to nationwide disenchantment with large public social programs, some to a backlash against the cultural shifts of the 1960s, and some to the increasing conservatism of aging baby boomers. Most of these explanations place the impotence on the mood of the American electorate, suggesting that liberal and moderate Republicans died out because they failed to adapt to the changing political climate. I submit an alternative hypothesis. The liberal and moderate Republicans were hunted into extinction by their more aggressive conservative cousins, who wielded a powerful new weapon that was highly effective at galvanizing their political base. The weapon was persecution politics. Even as conservatives extended their dominance over the Republican Party and the country as a whole, their sense of persecution increased. They turned up their attacks on powerful liberal elites and invented a new victim class that fused whites, Christians, and the working class into a loose affiliation they called conservatives, traditionalists, or real Americans. The formation of the new victim class precipitated the widespread fear and paranoia that exploded after Obama's election and spawned the Tea Parties. The Tea Parties then inherited the mantle of persecution politics. To see how this happened, we will need to return once more to the beginning of the story. Again, this is where I talk about Paul Weyrich and the purges that they enacted. Now, at the time, the pundits said, "Oh, you know, these right-wing people, they can't win, and this will doom the Republicans." What in fact happened is, while they did lose seats in the Northeast, they got a lot more seats in the rest of the country. These were conservative Republicans, not liberal or moderate Republicans. By 1992, the conservatives, which had been the wing of the Republican Party, were able to actually take over the leadership of the party and put people like Newt Gingrich into power in Congress. And not only did that not spell not only did this conservatism spell the end of the Republican Party, they actually gained more power. 2 years after that, in 1994, was the Republican Revolution, in which the Republicans swept back to power, controlled both houses for the first time in 40 years. Now, the exact same thing happened in 2006-2008. Normally, the standard policy when a party loses big in the elections is they moderate. They say, okay, we have to get back the independents, we have to get back the moderates. That didn't happen. Instead, the Republicans went right, and you got the Tea Parties, and they actually purged the few moderates that were left. And again, the pundits were wrong. They didn't lose. They won big, they won big a month and a half ago, despite the fact that they went further right than ever. So, just the last 2 pages, and then I'll take questions. That sums this all up. Some Democrats welcome the Republican heretic hunts, reassuring themselves that ultra-conservatives like Rand Paul and Sharon Angle might win in the primaries, but they're too extreme to win in the general elections. And as we saw Rand Paul won and Sharon Angle lost, barely. But even if Republican extremism hurts the party in the short run, history suggests that the long run is another matter.